The Symphony of Canterlot, Chapter 18, Hard-Boiled. The smell only got worse as we reached the end of the stairwell into the somewhat derelict Canterlot sewer system, a strange and humid mishmash of centuries-old stone brick masonry and modern machinery that was built in to meet with the current standards of sanitation. The sewers were expansive, each tunnel easily 7 meters high and 7 meters wide. The entire place had old mechanisms and ruins built in by the original unicorn stonemason some 500 years ago. And believe it or not, it was by order of Celestia. She considered that while Canterlot was a city built in a time of peace, and was by all standards built to be impressive and impractical, a place to live well rather than defend, and the nobles of the time, considering who they were, felt that it was ludicrous that the city would be built without any defenses. So, as an overly elaborate insult, she ordered the construction of escape entrances all around the city into, then, the new sewage system. Celestia also paid the Masons additional wages at the cost of the House of Platinum, the noble house that complained about the lack of defenses in the first place. Whether that was a good move on Her Royal Highness's part solely depends on how much one despises the wealthy. I personally found it hilarious. As a former soldier, I should object. But I felt that if any invading army had already managed the gall to go through the rest of either the west coast or the east coast, Equestria was already as good as dead anyway. Canterlot Mountain is in the spank middle of the northern Equestrian continent. The amount of towns and cities that would have to be seized back then in order to replenish the resources of the invading army was no small number. Add to the time on the battlefield and the resistance of the citizens themselves, and you're essentially making it abundantly clear that any invading army was just better off taking the surrounding coastal cities, and then demands that Equestria surrenders. The cost of time, resources, and life of the soldiers of the invading army would have potentially cost more than the reward for such an action. Though, considering that Celestia can burn down navies, and that the Pegasus legions of the time could have created typhoons and thunderstorms that would have been let loose without any control, industrial weather control was only invented a good 100 years ago after all, that would have been unlikely. But with the invention of large military airships, rocket packs, even if the technology was invented by an equestrian engineer, magic siphoning field projectors, the machine gun, and chemical weapons in the late 50 years leading to the events presented here, I considered that the feat of conquering Equestria was more likely than ever at the time. If Equestria was on the bad side of a wealthy and militarily competent empire like the Rus Empire, Thule Germania, and the Zing Empire, or even Nippon, it was doomed. Equestria might have had the resources and scientific prowess to fight them had the need been present, but it had to have a complicant population and a military that, for all intents and purposes, was considered a joke to the rest of the world. No matter how powerful and brilliant Celestia was, she was only one mare. Eventually, she would fall. Celestia was a sorceress. She gave up the axe after banishing Nightmare Moon. Her fighting instincts were gone. The old gal was out of practice, and she never caught up with the times when it came to warfare. So, in the end, Equestria was vulnerable and too spoiled to care. It's kind of funny how the world used to be. You know, in many ways, Equestria was under complete voluntary and blissful ignorance, yet I was cursed with the truth, but I'm done wasting your time. Let's continue. As me and Mary descended, I was getting the feeling that something was waiting for me, but I had no clue what.
Folklore!
Mary called for me and galloped quickly to my side.
What's wrong? You've been sweating bullets and it's getting colder the further we go down. Something's bothering you.
She actually showed some concern for me, and I could tell that it was genuine. I miss her. Sorry, I guess the scene back there just spooked me more than I thought. The bodies that were torn asunder died in less than 3 seconds. That's the only explanation as to why there wasn't much damage to the walls and there were so few hoof steps on the street. Whatever hit them came in like a small tornado of blades, shredding them before they had a chance to know something was off. Yes, back then I really did wonder just what could possibly do that quickly. But then again, a lot of things were new back then. We finally reached the end of the stairwell into the 300-year-old or so enchanted iron door that was between the stairwell and the sewer. I could sense activity through the door. 4 unicorns, averagely powerful, one of them with some sort of compact ether electrical generator on his back, and that connected to something that I just couldn't make out with my ether sensitivity alone. Nevertheless, I just decided to use my ectoplasmic manipulation by turning the sound damp and foul-smelling air to ectoplasm. The lock may have been good, but it was hundreds of years old. I simply just had to insert the ectoplasm through the keyhole and send in a bit of magical surge to cause the lock to open. It was all in less than a minute, really. It was odd that it was locked though, but considering the evidence of an assault, it's possible that the ponies attacking made sure that no pony or creature could escape. Vicious, but smart. All the other entryways from the city were probably locked as well, and that caused me some concern. They weren't going to take any prisoners, meaning that the spilling of blood was certain. We entered with caution and with the weapons at the ready, me with my Kurdish dagger and Mary with my .44 snub-nose revolver. The stone tunnel's walls were lined with steam and propane gas pipes and pipes containing electrical wiring. It was spacious enough to trot at either of the trotways at either side of what can only be described as a large stream of crap, and probably a bit over half a meter deep. The large corridor we entered in vaulted, meaning that there were buildings right above us. Me and Mary took the trotway closest to the stairwell we just entered through. We maintained a silence, moving in such a way as to make minimal amounts of sound. I myself was even using a dampening spell on my hooves. Up until I saw the blotches of ether and the rippling of the sewer water. And then it started. I couldn't believe it. They had some form of perception dampening. That was my shtick. I telekinetically used one of my throwing knives hidden under my sleeve at his exposed throat. His perception dampening came down the moment he was going to react, only for that to be stopped by having 4 inches of steel in his throat. Within that second, I violently launched his weapon to my direction, and I telekinetically stopped it mid-flight from it hitting my face. While still keeping his weapons floating, I watched as he sputtered and choked, stumbling to the other trotway. It must have hit the carotid artery because his blood was spraying everywhere in high pressure, and even it got on my face. He twitched for about 5 more seconds before he finally died. I could have taken him out of his misery earlier, but I wanted to see if he also had one of those creatures I'd captured back in Philharmonic Hall, dwelling within him like that other bastard. I got close and I looked at him once over. He was wearing some chest-plated steel armor with small shoulder pads, and the armor was made with modern military thinking in mind, built more for practicality rather than aesthetic. It looked factory-made, rather than it being the work of a blacksmith like it came straight out of an assembly line. Underneath that, he was wearing a black combat uniform, completely devoid of indications of the rank, unit, or country, or even symbols of any kind. What it did have was pouches, quite a few actually, and what looked like some form of a double-barrel shotgun on his back, and on his left side, a holster holding a Germanian Parabellum pistol, or P-78 for short, and he was also wearing some welding goggles. After about 20 seconds of my poking around with a corpse, I telekinetically held what appeared to be a Tinker submachine gun, with a 100-round barrel magazine. Bloody Mary trotted behind me and had something ready to tell me as soon as I telekinetically threw her the Tinker gun, and she grabbed it.
I may be a trained assassin formerly from Albion folklore, but even I have to admit, that was pretty brutal. Isn't using your modus operandi interrogating before considering whether gratuitous murder is necessary?
I looked back at her with confusion. I thought we were on the same page about deadly force before we went down the stairwell. It is, but after what I went through yesterday, I think that the kill first, ask questions later thing is a better strategy to utilize here. You know, I thought you were fine with that. She sighed for a second, blowing another puff of cigarette smoke, probably remembering her own words up until we came here.
I did, but I didn't expect our enemy to be so much like us, or to be pink. His build also seems familiar.
It was true. His fur was pink and his hair blonde. His build reminded me of the Royal Guards. The implications for that would be nasty, and I preferred for her to focus, so I said, "It's best not to think about it. 4 more are coming, so just get ready." I wasn't lying, though. I had been keeping my mind's eye on them since we entered the sewer system. 4 more came from the end of the tunnel, turning towards us from the right. One of them had the ether of a sorcerer like myself, and the rest were only armed much the same way as the one I allowed to rapidly bleed to death a moment ago. I activated my trinkets and became enveloped in a perception dampening field. I galloped forward with the utmost haste, using my telekinetic abilities to both avoid slipping in the wet trotway. The spread in formation as if they were making a shield wall like the Royal Guard instead of taking cover behind the corners of the tunnel. That apparent sorcerer started charging a spell, but before he could finish, I pulled out the weapon that I picked up from the carnage we saw back in Corpse Alley, and pulled the trigger. There was a bolt of raw lightning that hit his head, and then he exploded in charred gore and cloth, his armor being left seemingly intact as it spread due to the explosion. That all took place within a second. My perception dampening trinket was still activated, so I jumped back. The boiling blood I had spilled splattered over the other three, distracting them and causing them to panic and scream, with one of them firing his Tinker submachine gun erratically from his right to the upward part of the tunnel, puncturing some of the gas pipes. Mary gave suppressing fire with a Tinker, and I passed her while she was standing on her back legs and firing with her forehooves, killing two with a hail of bullets that impacted them, resulting in blood splatter emitting from their bodies, their chest armor being penetrated as to me, it seemed that it was made with a different purpose than protecting someone against gunfire. The last stallion of the group tried to arm his own exotic-looking weapon. He had some sort of compact ether electrical generator on his back, the same one I sensed before entering this place. He trotted right into the unseen, but very much smelled clouds of propane gas that was being emitted from the bullet holes in the gas pipeline. So, I pyrokinetically sparked the gas that promptly set him on fire. He promptly began to flail around in agony, screaming bloody murder in ways that can only be perceived as being in the edge of Sheol itself. Of course, he then dived into the sewer water and promptly began to get up. The shock of the whole ordeal should have been enough to kill him. The sudden increase in temperature, the cooking of flesh, and the sudden drop would be too much to handle, even for an earthen, much less a unicorn. As he managed to stand up on all fours, I promptly shot him twice with a P-78 in the horn, and in the left frontal lobe, killing him instantly and just ending his misery. I heard Mary take off the belt of her black trenchcoat and then used it to tie the Tinker submachine gun to her back. As a result, I deactivated my perception dampening trinkets and we both galloped forward and then we turned right. We ran into a line of more soldiers, and they all had Tinkers, and opened fire. If we really had just done that, we would have both died then and there. But that is just what they saw. In reality, I was sitting in a lotus position in the left trotway. Nothing but a little ectoplasmic projection. And neither me and Mary moved about after she took the belt of her trenchcoat to tie the Tinker to her back. Naturally, when they emptied about 20 rounds off their 100-round magazines, they noticed that they were shooting at gas. At that point, I tossed to Mary one of the smoke grenades that I took for my first kill that evening. She caught it without fail, pulled the pin with her mouth, and threw it onto the right trotway, engulfing it in smoke. They immediately galloped into it, and then I telekinetically moved the smoke into their nostrils and muzzle, pushed it on all four of them. They tried to cough, but their mouths couldn't exhale at all. They fell to their knees, unable to breathe, and one of them looked at nowhere in particular with bloodshot eyes that I could see through his brass goggles. Eventually, all four suffocated in a matter of 3 minutes or so. Their intact bodies lay in either trotway in an almost symmetrical fashion. I quickly trotted towards the bodies on the right trotway first, ignoring the smoke as best as I could, and I coughed twice, but it didn't matter to me much. Mary quickly caught up with me and made a very interesting point.
We could have gunned them down. This seems a bit of a slow and torturous method to just kill a few ponies.
I replied in kind. It is, but I need the bodies intact. I sense something large ahead, and something tells me we're gonna have to use another one of my wartime tricks, and I need to act before these bodies start defecating. I stood there and activated my horn, and I got to work. I opened my mouth, letting out the ectoplasm that I got my body to produce, and let it form into the 4 distinct, smoky orange glowing tendrils. Mary, would you mind removing the gas masks? It would make things easier. She looked at me a bit incredulously, but she did as she was told. In about 40 seconds or so, she removed all 4 of the gas masks and brass goggles. Each of the tendrils got into a particular Thule soldier's mouth and eye sockets. Their bodies then began to convulse and shake a bit before trying to get on all fours, stumbling a bit and finally standing straight, looking to nowhere in particular as their eyes and mouths glowed orange of my ethereal field. I stopped inserting magic into them so I could start removing their weapons, and something told me and Mary that we were gonna need them. Two of them had other weapons on their backs. One had what looked like some sort of rifle, while the other had what looked like a bulkier double-barrel shotgun. I telekinetically took the shotgun and gave it a good hard look. It had a magazine that wrapped around it, the mechanism complex, but it wasn't something unlike I'd seen in a Maxim's guns before. It dawned on me that this double barrel was probably semi-automatic. Whoever designed this wanted a trench devastator, something to use as a means of clearing a section of a trench from an enemy squadron, and quickly, the weapon was probably even better for use in corridors. This was a weapon for war. One I hadn't seen before, but definitely something that I could recognize as made by an experienced manufacturer, and one bloody shoal of a mechanical engineer. The words indicating where the ammo feed were printed in Germanian, and it looked like something the country would produce as well. Huh. Impressive, I said with some sincere admiration of the weapon's designer's ingenuity.